Well, thank you very much. And thanks to all the doctors on the call here. Looks like we've got almost 40 now. Great turnout. Just a quick background on me and Kyle here. I'll start. I'm going to be acting as sort of the moderator today. Kyle is going to do most of the presentation. I'll be asking questions and cover a few slides, but it's going to be kind of an organic back and forth. And if you guys have questions, which I'm sure you will as they come up, please type them into the Q&A section, and then we'll handle all those questions at the end. So I've been in the dental industry for right at 20 years. Really dates me. I started with a company called OrthoCAD, which many of you might be familiar with. It was, like I said, it really dates me. Their main product at the time was you would pour up your stone model and send it into OrthoCAD. And then we would digitize the model and make a digital model and send it back to you for $40 each. So we were doing 10,000 of those a month at the time, way back in the early 2000s. Then in 2000, from 2008 to 2021, I was in dental cone beam sales. Got to be known as Ty the iCat guy. I might have sold a few of you on the call here an X-ray or two, but the majority of my career is in X-ray sales, selling 3D cone beam machines, and got to know a lot of the top practitioners in the U.S. Got on a first name basis with them. That was really a blessing for me. And then I actually got introduced to Kyle's company, the company he founded all the way back in 2006 or seven, and became a referral source for them, and went out on my own and started doing practice transitions, partnered with PTS, and then I joined the team a little over about a year and a half ago, and been going at it ever since. So it's been a great ride in dental, and now I really blessed to be in this space because I feel like we're being a good shepherd for all the doctors that are making the biggest decision of their life, and helping them protect their biggest asset. So with that, I'll hand it off to Kyle for his introduction, and he's got quite a story in dental too. And so I'll hand it up to Kyle.
Thanks, Ty, man. I couldn't be happier to have you on the team, by the way. So maybe as a little bit of background, I went to Baylor down in Texas. Very much thought I was going to get involved in institutional capital out of school. So I had an offer on my desk from Goldman Sachs to go and work in their investment banking division down in the Dallas division, which was mostly oil and gas. And anyway, I did a shadow program with them for a week and saw the way they lived life, and it just wasn't for me. 100-hour work weeks, 200 days a year on the road, just wasn't quite the family life that I wanted. And so the other way of getting involved in that type of world is by specializing in an industry. So I took a couple hundred interviews out of college. I know that sounds goofy, but I did, and I found this funny little world of dentistry. I had no tie to it at all. And all of these little entrepreneurs out there, some of them knew what they were doing and some of them didn't. I was like, well, shoot, if nothing else, I can help them. And I had a baby face at the time, and I went on board with Sullivan Shine at that point, now Henry Shine, and I started building offices out in West Texas. And because I had that baby face, people weren't taking me very seriously, so I started to do contract work. So I do lease renegotiations, buy-sell agreements, associateship placements, really anything I could get my hands on that people would take me seriously. And I guess by 2007, I was getting more calls for that than anything else. So I started up a company to specialize in transitions and transactions within the dental space. So essentially kind of an M&A firm, just focused on dentistry. Look, over the last 15 years, continued to grow it. And we're now, the largest M&A firm in dentistry, which is fun and interesting and exciting. And it's cool that we get to help so many folks. And what we've done, 550 or so transactions. And so whether it's, individuals, partnerships, DSOs, direct to private equity, all those different types of deals. We've done all of them, and I guess there's pros and cons with all of them. And I think that the core competency of our company at this point is going to be helping doctors understand what the options are, right? And once they understand what the options are, they're going to make the best decision for themselves one way or the other. So anyway, that's a little bit about me. By the way, I do have a son and a daughter. I've got a son who's 9, his name's Cole, a daughter who is 12, her name's Addie, and both of them are playing basketball tonight. So, but happy to be here with y'all.
Great. Thanks, Kyle.
Good. Well, so I guess kind of what we're going to be going over today, I guess first things first is going to be beginning with the end in mind. So this is not a new concept, right? So if you think about Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, I think it just kind of harkens back to that. And kind of having an understanding of what you want to accomplish before you accomplish it is something that is going to be really key. I think that one of the hardest things that we end up dealing with as folks that advise dentists on transitions is going to be folks who show up with not very much time left, right? And decide, hey, I need to figure out something in the next couple of months or in the next year. We just end up kind of working with one hand tied behind our back at that point. Don't you agree, Ty?
Yeah, definitely. It's just, being yeah, go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
Good, right. Well, I think the second thing we want to talk about is going to be just making understand the asset that you've created, right? And so, all of the time, effort, energy, sleepless nights, all those different types of things. What is that value that you have in your practice, and how does it change as well, depending on who the buyer is? Second or the third thing that we're going to be talking about is going to be building a dream team, right? And so I'm a big believer that it's hard to do things alone, right? And sometimes dentistry is talked about as a little bit of a lonely profession, right? It's hard to run things past different folks that actually know and can help and all those different types of things. And it's not one, it's not two, it's multiple people that you need to have on your team going through the process like this. And then the final thing is going to be maximizing the value of that asset. So first you got to understand what the value is, and then finally you have to maximize that on the back end, and just kind of the how to do that as well. And by the way, whenever we're talking about value there, please don't think of this as just monetary value. That's part of it, right? But if you think about it in terms of legacy as well, I think that's a big part of this discussion as well.
Yeah, and Kyle, to get back, to your handoff on planning transition with the end in mind, my brain needed to reboot. Sorry about that. But yeah, that was one of the things that attracted me to PTS when I was an independent consultant, was just I was doing transitions on my own and partnering with PTS and some other brokerages too. And PTS just consistently returned better results than anyone. And it all started with that start with the end in mind, because a lot of our clients don't actually choose the highest offer. They choose the best work-life balance. It's a combination of many things, so that starting with the end in mind is just very important. So just wanted to re-emphasize that.
Yeah, completely. So well, so in talking about that, maybe we just kind of, go into, where are doctors in their career? Ty, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So pretty much everyone falls into, we call it U version 1.0, 2.0, and then there's two versions of the 3.0. So I think all of you probably fall into one of these categories. So U 1.0, you're right out of school or a few years out of school. You're an associate in a practice. You might have bought into an existing practice, or maybe you hung a shingle and built a startup. Then you move along in your career, your practice becomes established. You don't have to worry about, paying the rent every month. It's making great money. You've maybe even expanded, added a second, a third, a fifth. We have a client that has a 19th office. So, you've added you're just growing your dental empire. You maybe added an associate or associates, and you've got a great reputation, and your practice is solid. So probably many of you are in that boat right now. So then U 3.0, well, there's two versions of it. So think of this as the part in your career where you're starting to think about an exit strategy, or in many cases, dentists don't worry about it, and I'm going to work till I want to retire, and now I want to retire. So what do I do now? Well, we advise to plan ahead. The traditional way to sell your dental practices, well, there were a couple of different ways to do it. One way, which many people have done, is what we call a Mercer acquisition. And that's where you sell off percentages of your practice over time in hopes to get near 100% of collections. So, for instance, let's say you have $1.5 million practice, you might sell off a third for 500,000, then another third for 500, and then your exit for 500, and hope to get near 100% of collections. Another way is just to outright sell your practice and walk away. And the going rate or the market rate for that is basically 70 to 80% of collections. We're probably going to get more into this on the second webinar, but dentist offices have been historically undervalued due to bank ceilings on loans, but we'll get into that more on the other webinar. But at any rate, selling at 80% of collections is about the market rate. But you still have to, you still have, if you stay on, in many cases, they'll ask you to stay on to help transact, and maybe they want you to stay on for a while. And then is your administrative burden lightened? Is there going to be a name change in the practice? What about your staff? And then you have to learn to work as a partner and employee, mesh practice philosophies. So the more modern way of doing things, since private equity, yeah.
Ty, before you keep on going, can I give a little bit of color commentary on that one?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, like if I look at the first, 5 years of my career, a vast majority of the transactions were these, right? And that's essentially, if you look back over the course of time, nearly all transactions within the dental field were this. As a matter of fact, I remember early on, this is probably back in 2006 and 2007. I heard so many people talking about like, well, I'm just going to go and shut the doors as soon as I'm done, right? Sometimes it was hard to convince people that they actually had value in the practice, and they did, and they had a ton of it, right? And so if you look at these types of transactions, look, they're tried and true, right? So if you end up selling, either parts and pieces to individuals over the course of time, it can work, and it can work well. We've done 40 or 50 of those over the course of time. I would say there's some hangups on the back end on a Mercer style transition, in that if you're a minority partner, then suddenly you're giving some of the agency to a couple of additional folks that may not exactly have your time horizon in mind. But I would still say the efficacy rate is really, really high with that. Selling to an individual, so if you're selling 100% of the business, well, you just cashed out the value of your practice. You may be staying on board, those kind of things, but you are completely and totally putting your next however long, into the hands of somebody that is going to have 100% ownership within the practice as well. So really high efficacy rate, but some people may not get exactly what they want out of that either, just because they're expecting that they might be able to stay on board. And again, sometimes incentives align and sometimes they don't. I mean, Ty, we talk about this on our team all the time, the success rate of associateships, right? Over a 5-year time horizon, it goes both ways, right? So if you bring on an associate, you're going to expect that it's only going to work out with that person 20% of the time over a 5-year time horizon. After a transition, and let's say you're the associate, you can also expect the exact same result, right? And so anyway, just a couple of things to be thinking about there. Sorry, Ty, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that was great. And then private equity came into dentistry, really started pouring in right before COVID. And then COVID really proved that dentistry was not only recession resistant, but pandemic resistant. So then it really heated up, started heating up right after COVID. And there's a lot of private equity backed groups that we work with that offer dentists this option that they never had before. A few years ago, we'd never be talking about this. A few years from now, we probably won't be talking about this. So it is a somewhat of a finite runway. We estimate that the dental industry is, experts say between 30 and 40% consolidated. An industry reaches what we call equilibrium when it's 60 to 65% consolidated. That means that private equity investment, institutional investment in dentistry will basically move to another sector whenever dentistry or basically all the attractive practices to private equity have sold. But we're not there yet. We're right in the middle of the consolidation wave. Imagine a bell curve, and we're at the top or just a little past the top of the bell curve. So you might be thinking, okay, why is all this private equity money funneling into dentistry? And that's another lecture probably on private equity. But if you do any research on private equity, you'll learn that institutional investors are very good at making returns on their money well in excess of the stock market. So dentistry has a bunch of things that are right up top of the list for institutional investors. For one, dentistry is a need versus a want. We joke when people quit having teeth, then dentistry will go out of business. So it also creates recurring revenue. So you don't take care of your tooth up front, it gets worse. You eventually end up spending a lot of money, whether you do it now or you put it off. It's recurring revenue. And also it's very fragmented dentistry. So lots of entrepreneurs in dentistry. Anytime an industry is fragmented, it presents an excellent opportunity for institutional investors to come in, and it's 1 + 1 = 3. 100 of your practices scaled with back office operations, HR, payroll, purchasing, centralized, is worth way more than 100 of your practices individually. Also, a stat from Bank of America, there's a less than 1% failure rate on new practice loans. So you guys are a great investment for private equity. And on top of everything else, you're a mostly cash business. Dental insurance is kind of an oxymoron. If you have insurance on your home, burns down, it's taken care of. Have car insurance, total your car, taken care of. And you all know, not quite that way in dentistry. So mostly a cash business. So this new opportunity, U 3.0, you can partner with a private equity backed group and get paid a multiple on the profit of your practice, which is known as EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So what this allows you to do is eliminate the administrative burden with full clinical autonomy. These groups private equity figured out that a happy Dr. Smith produces like this, and a mad Dr. Smith who's being controlled and told how to practice goes like that. So they've acquiesced. Now there are some groups out there that use the business model of, we call it, there are aggregationist groups and activist groups, and we work mostly with the aggregationist groups. The activist groups are the ones that, think of yourself, if you join them, you're just more of an employee following their cookbook. The aggregationist groups are the ones normally started by doctors for doctors that have just gotten a private equity infusion to grow. So your staff stays intact, your name stays on the door, you enjoy all the efficiencies and economies of scale of a big group while still having it feel like your private practice. And one of the biggest things that, might be a surprise to you, you get to maintain agency in the decision making. I know, Kyle, you've got a number of stories in which, doctors sold to other doctors and wanted to carry on their legacy and promises were made. And, the legacy was, broken. And then there's, tons of cases where doctors do practice with, or they partner with DSOs because they do want to carry on their legacy. Private equity is investing in you. You are the product. So they want to carry on that legacy. So it might come as a surprise to, a lot of it, DSO might be a four-letter word. You might be thinking the exact opposite. Well, those aren't the groups we work with. And what investing or partnering with a clinically agnostic private equity-backed DSO creates the opportunity to create generational wealth as well. And Kyle, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting. I remember back in 2011, I was doing a couple of deals out in West Texas, and I sold both of them to a very well-known DSO. It was a dumpster fire, right? The doctors left, they were ticked. Staff left, they were ticked as well. DSO was mad at me. I was the one who put everybody together. And at that point, I said, you know what? I'm never doing this again. Right? I'm only going to do individual to individual transactions. I just understand them better, and gosh darn it, it would be better to have that dentist be the next owner. It's just kind of funny the way that never ends up working in a way. What I've found is going to be that I think that DSOs or private equity backed groups are really similar to dentists in total. I think that there are really good clinicians and there are really bad ones out there. I've seen them both, right? And I think that echoes with DSOs. I think there are really terrible DSOs out there, and I think there are really good ones that actually do care about the end result of the doctor-patient relationship. If you put a really terrible DSO with a really great practice, it's going to blow up. It's an inevitability, right? If you put a really terrible clinician with a really great DSO, it's actually equally as bad. It's a really terrible outcome as well. You put a terrible clinician with a terrible DSO, surprisingly enough, it kind of works. It may not be the outcome that you want, but it does kind of work in total. But I'll tell you what, if you can put a really great clinician with a really, really great financial backer, man, you could be cooking with gas on a lot of different, or I guess in a lot of different ways. And some of those ways are financial, right? And some of them are going to be, legacy retention type of ways as well. So I think that, from an efficacy standpoint, what we found is going to be this, U 3.0 modern version. It actually trends the exact same way from an efficacy rate as selling to individuals as well. Cool. Well, so in terms of the timing of an exit strategy, so I guess maybe a couple of things to be thinking about here is, when do you start, right? And again, if you go back to the beginning with the end in mind concept there, I think the first place to start is going to be, look, it's not necessarily something that you're backing into, right? I hear lots of different doctors say, hey, 5 years before I am ready to do a transaction, I'm going to get an appraisal done, or 3 years beforehand, or a year beforehand. I really do think that this is a little bit of a fallacy. And the reason being is, if this is either your biggest or second biggest or third biggest asset, right, monetarily, it's a good idea to know what that asset is worth as you grow it as well. Because I think that if you know it earlier, you can understand how to leverage it in your favor, no matter what direction you want to go, right? Sometimes that means that you want to continue on practicing for another 15 years. Sometimes that means, when am I actually ready for that second practice? Sometimes that means, when am I bringing an associate on? Sometimes that means, do I want to bring that associate into a partnership position? And sometimes that also means, hey, there's a consolidation wave going on. Maybe I should understand what that looks like for this asset as well. So it may seem a little bit antithetical, but if it was me, and what I would be thinking of is going to be, I think it's always a great idea to understand the value of your practice and then track it. right? That doesn't mean you should contemplate a transaction one way or the other, but it does mean that at least you're equipped with the knowledge of understanding what that value is that you've created. Ty, do you agree with that in total?
Yeah, we've just, whether it's personal, professional, financial, it's, what we can do is help you be a good shepherd for you along the way, help you ferret out everything, when to start. I can't agree more. Start with the end in mind, start early.
Yep,
You want to start thinking about your exit strategy way before you want to exit, because
yep,
we've got a lot of stories. I wrote an article called "De-risking your biggest asset," and it's a unfortunate story. The one way to think of this is you're taking some chips off the table now. Think of it almost like a professional athlete who signs a guaranteed contract with a contract with an amount of guaranteed money. So you can take some chips off the table and have some financial stability, because many docs, you can't plan for you can plan for the future by starting early. Unfortunately, we had a client that we got some nice offers for, who put it off, and then they became ill and passed away, and we ended up having to sell the practice for pennies on the dollar. So it's one thing that people rarely think of, as Kyle mentioned, this is your biggest asset. So you think of your practice almost like Apple stock. It's good. It's going to probably continue to grow and provide you good income. But if your whole financial portfolio is in Apple stock, that'd probably be you'd feel pretty good, but at the same time, it would be a little nerve-wracking. So, I'd challenge you to think of your biggest asset in the same way.
completely agree. And I mean, that's probably why. I mean, again, that's why I feel like I've been, preaching to whoever will listen for quite some time, which is why, look, our average age of client is 44, right? And it's because it is a good idea to begin with the end in mind in total. And so, I mean, obviously, you can see on the side, benefits of early planning. I couldn't agree more with all of those, but I think that we're often asked, whenever we're working with doctors, when do we typically or start mapping the transaction? And most times with doctors, I say now, right? I can think of a doctor that I sold his very first practice in the Woodlands, Texas, and he ended up starting up another practice after that one was sold. He was thinking about moving out of state, decided not to, and then decided to move, I think, about 20 miles away or so. Started up another practice. A year later, he called me up and he was like, "Hey, I'm at $800,000 in revenue, right? What should I do?" I was like, "Well, you need to understand what it's worth, right? So you can make the best decision for you." It's the exact same thing whenever we sold your $4 million practice, right? And so, and that's what we're doing now, right? So I think he's in year two, maybe year two and a half of starting that practice up. And as an eventuality, we're going to be strategic about what he can do, right? Rather than reactionary to what he can do. So I think that's a really, really important thing. So I think that we're probably good on this side. You want to move to the next one, Ty? So in terms of the value of a practice, there's a lot of things that end up impacting value. Look, here at PTS, we've done, closing on 3,000 or so appraisals of practices across the US. And if I think about the way that we end up designing what that value ends up looking like, we look at different things depending on who the buyer is. So I'm going to give you some for instances. The first thing is going to be the total amount of revenue from the practice does matter. And it matters mostly to an individual and it matters mostly to a bank. And the reason being is that because it's so hard to kill a dental practice, I remember hearing that there's only the 5 Ds of killing a dental practice is going to be death, divorce, disability, diagnosis, and oh, geez,
Drugs,
I can't remember.
I think
Drugs.
drugs.
Thank you. Good night. Thank you very much. So anyway, if it's not one of those things, if you have a certain amount of revenue, it's just really, really sustainable to keep that going. That's something that a bank is going to look at, and that's something that an individual is going to look at on nearly every case. May assign a multiple to that, and that multiple is going to be based on a ton of different things. But I'll give you some examples there. Things like attractiveness of treatment protocol, right? So, like, what type of work are you doing? How many patients do you have? The total capacity, the footprint of your area. Who is doing the work? Hygiene recall, new patients, all sorts of different stuff. However, the biggest, I guess, characteristic there is going to be the attractiveness of the area. And so I'll give you an example here. I was born in a small town in Kansas, a town of 300. If we plopped any of y'all's practices in that small town, it's called Stanley, by the way. If we plop any of those practices here, I mean, look, it's just not going to go for a high number, and from a multiple standpoint. The reason being is that it's just hard to recruit to that area, right? Now, if we plopped that same practice in, oh, I don't know, Miami or Dallas, it's going to go for a lot more. Just the reason being is there's a lot of people looking to move to that area. So I think that's a big indicator here. The next one is going to be seller's discretionary earnings that an individual is going to look at. This is also driven by a bank. A bank wants to know is going to be what is the likelihood that they end up getting paid back if they make a really big note to somebody and they have to service that note, and how much is left over for that doctor that's purchased the practice. So it's essentially a cash flow analysis. That cash flow analysis is super important, and the reason being is that they don't want to have a stressed out borrower, right? And if they have a stressed out borrower, then essentially what that means that all of those different D's that are there that have a higher probability of happening if they're stressed out, right? And so, long story short, seller's discretionary earnings, the way that you easily think about that is going to be that's the total amount of money that you're making out of the practice, whether that's W-2 income, distributions, the total amount of tax treatments that you're running through the practice. It also could be, the total, like, let's say that you have a captive insurance program or you have a 401k plan that you're investing into, all these different things. You add all that stuff together, and that's the total economic outcome for your practice. That's super important as well. Um, uh, the, the, the other thing that is going to be really important here is going to be, if we do understand that practices can be valued differently by different types of buyers, well, it's important to understand that distinction. So again, for years and years of my career, this is the total way you did it. You looked at the total collections, you looked at the attractiveness of the area, you looked at the total amount of seller's discretionary earnings. You end up kind of putting all of these little tiny indicators in there in terms of how many patients, payer mix, all that different type of stuff, and out popped the result. It was pretty formulaic, and it was essentially driven by a bank. The other type of buyer is going to be, it's much less concerned with it, with what a bank is going to lend on a practice like this, because if you put 100 dentists together, the chances are they're not going to be as worried about one of those people falling off a mountain bike and getting disabled, right? And so if you put those 100 practitioners together, they're going to be offering way differently. And they're going to be offering off of what's called EBITDA, which is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Easiest way of thinking about that is going to be take off your doctor hat for a second, put on your investor hat, and say, hey, what if you no longer wanted to practice chairside, but you still wanted to own the practice? Well, in that case, you have to hire an associate to do the work that you're currently doing. And this is the amount that it would be spinning off for you after that associate is paid a fair wage. So that's kind of what EBITDA is. That's my shorthand way of thinking about it. And so they're essentially going to look at the total cash flow, and they're going to have a multiple associated with it as well. And all of those other indicators that I just mentioned, all that matters here, right? I would also probably put in, age of provider matters here a little bit. If you look at replicatability of treatment protocols, recruitability to the area, those all matter as well. But long story short, what it allows for is going to be a practice that is really well run, can lever up the value of their practice pretty substantially just by changing who that buyer is and nothing else. So anyway, I think that from a valuation perspective, those are the two different sides to be thinking of. And Ty, wouldn't you say that calculating SDE and calculating EBITDA, that's one of the things that we end up talking with doctors about all the time, just kind of how this works. And, is their CPA thinking about it correctly and all those kind of things? Wouldn't you say that's like an everyday conversation for us?
Yeah, for sure. Excellent, segue into the next slide here about multiples. I'm sure a lot of you on the call here have had, your peers, your friends, probably some of you on the call have transacted with a group, and you're talking to your friends and peers, and they're talking about what multiple they got. And so what we are able to do, I can tell you that you would much rather have a reputable broker doing your valuation and figuring and computing your EBITDA, which is what, as Kyle mentioned, is what the private equity backed groups pay on multiples of EBITDA. That's how they value your practice. You would much rather have us doing that on your behalf rather than have a group calculating it for you. I'll make an analogy. It's like having a big court trial and going in and defending yourself versus going in and getting a good representation with an attorney. You know, which outcome is going to be best. So here's an example. You know, your friend might be saying, "Oh, I got an 8.5x multiple." Well, let's take a couple of examples here. For instance, let's say that your friend went, we call it an unsolicited offer. He or she got approached directly by a group, went down the path with them. They're doing about 2 million in collections and say their EBITDA was computed at about 300,000. Well, I got an 8.5x on my practice. Well, that's about 2.5 million. Whereas we do the valuation, we figure out your real EBITDA and we defend it. And uh, we get you, let's say, 7x. Well, okay, you can tell your friends that you got a 7x, but that's a $3.5 million valuation on a 7x versus, or no quotes on the 7x, real 7x versus an 8.5x on 300K of EBITDA. So you can see how EBITDA can easily be manipulated, and that's not an indictment on the groups, but if you think about it as a steward of the biz dev manager or whoever you're working with directly with a group on your own, as a steward of the capital of the group, it's their job to get you the lowest offer possible that you'll be ecstatic with. Our job is the exact opposite, and not just, to ramp up the offer as much as we can while finding your right work-life balance, basically starting with the end.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, look, I wrote an article, I guess a little bit ago about, how multiples don't matter. And I'm not the biggest PR guy in the history of the world, but the purpose of it was to talk about that multiples matter, but only so much. And whatever we think about this, because you can manipulate EBITDA calculations pretty easily in total, you can justify a lot of different multiples being paid in total. The key is understanding what your enterprise value ends up being. So essentially, I kind of dissect that into three buckets, right? So it's going to be how much money do you get day one? How much money do you have working for you in the future? And then how much money do you have to wait on? So essentially, you're being the bank. And once you understand what your EV is, which is going to be the compilation of, hey, how much EBITDA, how much profitability do I have? What is the multiple? What is the attractiveness of the asset that I have? Well, then suddenly we understand what your EV is, and then we can best leverage it, right? If you don't understand one side or the other of that equation, then suddenly you're just kind of you're playing a game against a loaded deck, right? It is a completely different type of transaction, and you may feel really good about it, but the issue is that did you have the comparables to kind of understand and again make that best choice on the back end?
Sure.
Yep. Do you know what? As I'm thinking about it, if if we end up having like, let's think about this as an example. If we end up having a practice go through a marketed process and they have, oh, I don't know, 5 to 7 different types of offers to choose from, how often is it in your eyes that we end up having a wide range of multiples and a wide range of EBITDAs being given credit for?
Oh, almost every time.
Right.
And yeah, and that's why we use ours as a baseline, and then we compare the enterprise value of all of them. So we decipher all of the LOI, letters of intent, and put them side by side for you.
Yeah, exactly. And it is kind of funny that I end up hearing, like, hey, I got a 10x. It's like, okay, but 10x of what? And so anyway, I think that understanding that baseline is, again, I think it's an educational process. A long story short, uh, no different than the way that you end up cutting a crown, right? And the why behind it, those kind of things. And if you end up creating something that is going to be structurally sound from a crown perspective, you're going to have long-term success. I think about this no differently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Um, Go ahead, Todd.
yeah, I was just gonna say, so if you're thinking about a transition, putting together your dream team here. So ideally, your CPA, your attorney, your practice consultant, and your practice broker should all be disparate entities. We are a sell side fiduciary for you, and the other parties listed obviously should be that as well. There are instances where sometimes some of these people are on the same, work for the same firm. We always recommend, if you can, keeping all those entities disparate to serve in your best interests. Anything to
Yeah,
add?
couldn't agree more. Yeah, well, I guess first of all, couldn't agree more. And secondly, I think that the real reason for that is going to be you have multiple eyes on this, right? And again, if this is going to be one of the most important transactions that you're going to experience in your life, I mean, look, I would love it if you just took my word for it, right? But honestly, I think it's wise to have checks, And so, whenever I think about CPAs, as a for instance, does your CPA understand these types of deals? And if they don't, like, how are they going to be willing to become educated on those kind of things, right? And look, nobody's going to understand your books better than what your CPA is. And what we find is a really, really great CPA will help us decipher where the profitability is potentially hiding within your practice as well, because we can only see what we can see from a P&L standpoint. And somebody who understands the ledgers on the back end can be really, really, really valuable from generating the right amount of profit there. Because again, you don't want to leave dollars on the table whenever it comes to these types of things. It's kind of interesting. And I've been asked many, many times, like, hey, why is it that we don't have an attorney to serve, the doctors that we end up working with? Because, we'll do 100, 150 transactions a year. It might be easier if we did have that person. But look, I don't ever want to be in a place where there's the possibility of that person driving a deal through just because they're not working for the right person. If the attorney is working for me and not for you, I just don't think that's the right thing in total. So we have a great network of attorneys. So if you don't have one that's really, really great at these types of deals, no harm, no foul. Hopefully your broker would be able to help you with that as well. Finally, look, we think it's great to have a consultant. Some of the most smooth transactions that we end up being involved in are going to be ones that consultants are a part of. And sometimes that also means that, as we go through an initial analysis of the practice, we end up, putting you and your consultant back to work for another 6 months or 12 months, right? In order to achieve the right type of deal for you as well. Again, if we have time on our side, then suddenly these types of people can be really, really valuable for us as well. Ty, like, I don't know if this is something that you want me to answer, or if this is something you want to answer, but like, if we think about, uh, the tough stories about people not necessarily understanding exactly what they're getting into, those kind of things, what mistakes have we seen, from a doctor perspective that impact the sale of their practice? What comes to mind first for you?
Um, Well, it's almost always, the mistake of that, the lure of that unsolicited offer. And they just don't think anything. They let the DSO start with their end in mind, which could in certain cases be inflated for marketing purposes. Well, one of the things we do is try to level set the expectations. So, like you mentioned, the three buckets. Sometimes, doctors, their main goal might be to have as much take home pay as possible, or their main goal, I've got one transacting this week is, that they're their main goal was to get private equity investment or private company stock with the DSO that they were partnering with. So you know there are just so many mistakes that can be made without a advisor working with you. But I would say probably the main one that I see is doctors. It feels in some cases unrepresented doctors especially have gotten themselves into what feels like a reverse mortgage.
Mm.
So,
Yep.
mhm.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah. So I think the unrepresented thing is a big one, and I also think like if I pull back to teams just for a second, um, not having either a CPA on the team that understands how to pull apart and actually create an EBITDA calculation. Again, EBITDA is a finance term. It is not an accounting term, right? And I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing. However, we see some interesting advice, to say the least, from folks that don't understand what true profitability actually means, right? I would also say that, choosing a brother-in-law who's the attorney, so I think we do end up seeing, team type of things as well. And again, I hope this doesn't sound self-serving, but a broker who is worth their salt and actually will do the work. I find that as a big mistake as well. So if I end up putting it in kind of like mistakes around types of transactions, a lot of it actually does kind of come down to the type or quality of the advice that the doctors end up getting. Because again, like you can't expect that you are going to be, a mergers and acquisitions expert, right? I definitely don't, want my hands in anyone's mouth. Nobody else wants my hands in their mouth either, and cutting a prep. And I think that the same type of thing applies to the other side of the equation, which is like, look, have excellent results follow excellent advice, and I think you have a much higher probability of success with that in total. Yep.
Yeah. And so we work, there are more options than you've ever had before because of this thing called private equity that has become a big friend of dentistry in many cases. According to the McKinsey report through June 2024, there were 132 trillion assets under management in private equity. Another stat that stood out to me is that almost right at 50% of all merger and acquisition transactions involve private equity in some way. So we've leveraged that in dentistry. I would say that our firm, Kyle mentioned, we're the largest merger and acquisition advisory firm in the nation, and with that becomes experience and reach. So normally for our clients, we're able to get them, very high valuations, multiple offers to choose from, multiple deal structures. And, I know that many of my clients that have transacted have had a recapitalization event. So I'll get probably part to hand it off to you to talk about recapitalization.
Yeah, well, I'm going to go back to your analogy that you started using beforehand, which is going to be, if you consider a doctor's practice like Apple stock, as a for instance, Apple stock is great. Most people are pretty happy that they own Apple stock. However, again, you go to a financial planner and you say, "Hey, I have millions of dollars worth of Apple stock and not much else." They might look at you a little bit cross-eyed in total, and what they might put you in is going to be mutual funds. Mutual funds are great, right? So they provide a very nice return for whoever holds them as well. However, most of the time mutual funds aren't going to outperform a single stock, right? From an outcome perspective, they're just a whole heck of a lot less risky in total. Now, what we've seen over the course of time within dentistry is going to be that these mutual funds, in this case of dental practices, they grow way faster than what an individual practice can grow. And so it brings in the idea of equity arbitrage. So right now, if you own 100% of your singular practice, essentially kind of what you have as a financial instrument is going to be an annuity. An annuity essentially kind of pays you for continuing to own the asset going forward. Most people who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, even 60s probably don't have annuities as part of your overall investment thesis, but your practice kind of operates like that. If you take that cash flowing asset and essentially arbitrage where the equity lives, so instead of owning 100% of a singular asset, instead owning at a holding company or owning it because of a joint venture or owning because of a sub DSO, suddenly what you get the benefit of is going to be your equity can now live in a de-risked environment because now you're kind of combining your equity with a whole bunch of other doctors, and at the exact same time, it can grow a whole heck of a lot faster. Now, the average rate of return for a DSO is going to be right at a 4.7x times return over a 5-year time horizon. So, that's coming up on like 80% year-on-year returns. That's just the average. It's the norm. That is not unicorn, right? And so, if instead of taking that annuity, right, if you can compare and contrast that to your equity living at a different location where it can grow faster, well, suddenly you can actually outperform where your equity lived beforehand. So that's the arbitrage, is taking equity within one environment and taking it to another place where it can just do better in total. And again, I think probably the reason we can say that with a fair amount of confidence is going to be that we've seen, hundreds of transactions of this taking place. And long story short, if you think about it from a private equity perspective, they actually look at dentistry as a hedge on their risky investments. Call it a 4.7 times return over a 5-year time horizon is fine for private equity, but it essentially is there to protect them against their really high risk investments, technology, those kind of things. And so, long story short, I guess what it allows you to do is to compare and contrast your different types of options, right? So maybe option A ends up being like, well, just keep the practice. Option B, you can sell it off over the course of time to individuals. Option C is going to be, well, maybe you do take advantage of this equity arbitrage then. Because here's the thing, from a consolidation standpoint, an industry only consolidates one time, right? So if you look like medicine in the 1980s, and there's hundreds of other, options of consolidation that have been out there. If you guys ever want an interesting article to read, there's a great Harvard Business Review about the consolidation curve. But long story short, if you end up seeing where we are within that curve, there's only a finite period of time to consider this as one of the options. So, why not make the decision with your eyes wide open on it? Wouldn't you agree, Ty?
Absolutely. And when you say there's a finite amount of time, I always think of pharmacies. That used to be that's all there was mom and pop pharmacies. Now everything is CVS and Walgreens, that happened, 20-ish so years ago. And dentistry's going through the same thing, but there will always be great singular practices. I'm not saying that everything is going to be consolidate, but the industry or the sector will have reached equilibrium, like I talked about earlier, and private equity will move to a new sector.
Yeah, completely. I think maybe a key takeaway is going to be, time is of the essence, right? And if you ever, heard me speak even 3 years ago, I probably wasn't using that type of verbiage, right? Because I think that you should always operate out of a position of strength, not of weakness, not of being scared of, those kind of things. But it's a good thing to understand that we are on a finite curve for this. And so if you want to experience that type of option, it is better sooner rather than later to start.
Sure. All right, we've reached the hope you guys enjoyed that, and hope you found it informative. We've reached the question and answer section. We're going to take we're approaching the hour here, but we've got a few minutes for Q&A.
I'll go ahead and read the first one, Ty. I'll let you take it. Why can't my CPA conduct evaluation for my practice?
Because like Kyle said, it's a financial thing, not something that a CPA is going to be. Your CPA, if you have a good CPA, their job is to legally, of course, give you as much tax treatment as you can and make your income the way that you earn your income legally on the books, the most in the most tax advantageous way that they can. It's just a different way of computing the numbers. What we can do is lift the hood on your practice and value it as institutional investors would value it rather than how your CPA values it.
Yeah, and I might add that doesn't mean your CPA can't. Maybe they can, right? And we've seen some really, really great CPAs do some good work in that world as well. However, I think that it's an important distinction, between sellers' discretionary earnings and EBITDA. And we see this all the time. If a CPA is going to look at it and saying how much total money is taken out of the practice on a year-to-year basis, that's not what EBITDA is, right? EBITDA is the investment value. And so there is a distinction there. And I think that that is something that's an important thing to understand. Not that they can't, right? But I guess not that I can't do taxes either, but I don't think you want me doing your taxes. Long story short. All right. So, all right, I'll give you another one, Ty. Who should I reach out to first whenever I'm starting to plan my practice transition? CPA, broker, lawyer, consultant, and why?
Yeah, I would definitely say broker because the broker acts as the quarterback for all those other people. We help. We know how institutional investors view your practice, and we know how to assemble. We call it a prospectus. We know how to assemble a prospectus that is right up the fairway for what all the institutional investors are looking for. So if you started with your CPA, there could be a lot of back and forth. If these people are experts in their own field, and we're experts in M&A, mergers and acquisitions. So I would say start with us or, a reputable broker.
Yeah,
Mhm.
couldn't agree more. Yeah, I think your quarterback analogy is perfect there. And so, again, beginning with the end in mind, I think that is the way that I would go as well. So, okay, how about this one? How can a doctor determine if their practice goals, etc., are better to explore to transition to an individual or a DSO?
Ah, I would say get a prospectus done by a reputable broker, perhaps us. So that's what we can do is again lift the hood and show you exactly even if your practice is attractive to DSOs or if it would be more suited for an individual investor. And I'm sure people are wondering now, well, what's kind of the baseline? And Kyle, tell me you agree or disagree, but I think I see kind of the baseline nowadays for practices for us to put in a position to get multiple offers from different groups. The baseline on annual collections is around 1.5 million, and I would say 20%-ish EBITDA margin, which would be about 300,000 of EBITDA just in general baseline.
Yep.
Mhm.
So it's interesting, Ty. I do agree with you. I think that might take the answer just a little bit of a different direction. And so I think that this person is asking, like, how can they determine at this point? And I think my answer to that person would be, you don't, I don't think you know enough yet. Right? I
Yeah.
think that, and maybe I don't either, right? So if you came to me and said, hey, these are the general stats on my practice, I still think I would be guessing, in terms of what ends up being best for you, and I think that there's a lot of learning to do yet in terms of, hey, let's, identify the different types of options and then, compare them and contrast them on emotional and financial levels just to make sure it's the right thing in total, and then once we determine what the right thing ends up being, I think that informs the timing, and it informs who the buyer is and all those different types of things as well. So um, I, I think we're kind of talking the same language, but I might have taken a little bit of a different direction, Ty.
Yeah, no, the way I was basically saying, let us uncover everything for you and give you an
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
answer.
completely.
So here's a good one. Hey, how do you get compensated? So yeah, that's a really good one because various brokerages do that a lot differently. So our whole process is pro bono. We call it a success fee. We only get a commission if we successfully partner you with a group or sell you to another doctor if that's the transition that took place. And we call that a success fee. We don't have any retainer fees. We do the prospectus pro bono as a service for our clients. Next one is, when's the best time to sell? The end of the year or beginning of the year? Kyle, what do you think?
Yeah, we get asked this a ton, and I think that there might be a little bit of misconceptions around this as well. Really, whether you sell it to an individual or a group, it won't really matter. And here's the reason. Most of the allocation of the value of the practice ends up going to goodwill, which is a capital gain. A capital gain is not very much affected by how much you earn on a year-to-year basis. So every once in a blue moon, you might find somebody selling to an individual at the very, very, very start of the year. And because of that, they haven't had a time to make hardly any money out of the practice. And there's not very much allocated to the practice in total from an ordinary income perspective. And in that very unusual scenario, it can make sense to wait. Here's the flip side. The flip side is going to be if you track capital gains rates over the course of time, we're at historic lows with capital gains. And so, the chances are at some point or another, the federal government likes to spend money and needs more money to spend. And so, again, this has nothing to do with who's in the office or anything like that. We've not shown the ability to do a great job of moderating that spending very much. And so the easiest people to tax are going to be high earners and business owners. And if you own your own practice, you're both, right? And so if that's the case, then the chances are going to be greater the longer the time goes on. The capital gains rate end up going up. In 2021, they tried to raise them, didn't happen. But as an eventuality, I would say that that's a higher probability. So again, whether it's at the start of the year or the end of the year, I actually consider it nearly irrelevant. I think the tax risk that you're taking is going to be, what do they do with capital gains over time? I know that was a long answer, Todd, but I think
No,
that's
that's fine. And then we'll move to the end here. The last question: do you guys handle smaller practices? The answer is yes. We have another division called Headwaters that handles specifically doctor-to-doctor transitions. And then another person asked about our fee, and that would be a case-by-case basis on the percentage, and we'd be happy to chat with you more offline. Speaking of that, you can reach Kyle or me at the emails here, ty@professionaltransition.com or kyle@professionaltransition.com. And we're going to take a deeper dive on this next Tuesday, November 19th at 7:30. So we would love to see all of you there. And thanks very much for your attendance.